You're listening to Governance 360, a Link Group podcast hosted by me, Lindsey Doud. Hello everyone, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the next Link podcast. Our topic for today is SRDII and the future of transparency. And as well as our industry expert internally, Jay Baker, I'm very pleased to welcome our external speakers for today. They're both from Proxymity. Jonathan Smalley is the co-founder of Proxymity, and Andrew Myers is project manager. So just to kick off, Jonathan and Andrew, could I just ask you to explain a little bit more about Proxymity and your roles within the company?
Yeah, sure. Perhaps I'll lead off. So my name is Jonathan Smalley, co-founder of Proxymity. So we originally conceived Proxymity sort of about 2.5 years ago as at that point in time kind of no preconditions around it. We just looked at the world of investor communication, specifically the proxy voting ecosystem, and just said nothing really should be this complicated in this day and age. And that was really the seed that we decided to sow, and from that sprang at some point Proxymity. I've been through several kind of rounds of iterations of the platform, but fundamentally it looks to address the complexity that sits between a company and their shareholders and make the communication as seamless, frictionless and transparent as possible, and try and design away all of the complexity that I think we certainly feel no one should really have to face anymore. And that was it. And then we slowly grew the team as we grew the idea, and Andy joined us I think over 2 years ago now.
2 years ago, yeah.
So Andy joined the team to kind of head up the product management function as we took on more and more kind of work within the team, and the team's now over 20 strong, and that's something that we continue excited to progress, both develop the platform, build the team, and hopefully solve more and more of these problems. Andy, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. So yeah, I'm Andrew Myers. I'm the product manager of Proxymity, as you said. Been with the company just under 2 years now, and prior to that, spent about 10 years in the proxy provider space, in operations, client services, and product, where I got to see a lot of the challenges that John outlined in terms of how things work today and how it could be done much better, and how technology could bring a lot more to make it a much better way to execute than it is today.
That's great. Thank you, Andy. Can I ask you, Andy, just to identify for the listeners what the complexity of proxy appointments is in the current investor chain? From our client's perspective, what they see, or the issuer client sees, is that influx of voting or appointments on the last day.
Yep.
What does Proxymity do to address that?
Well, if you think about it, with voting, the two most important players really are the company and the shareholder. And in that, we've got the challenge of getting a communication together from the issuer when they announce a meeting to the investor. The chain that has to go through to get there is very complex today. There's a lot of players involved in passing that communication along the chain. There's a lot of re-entry of information, a lot of paper, a lot of inefficiency. So when it comes to voting back, to your point, Jay, the same problem plays back the other way. When the investor wants to vote, be it via a platform or whatever form they take, the vote has to be passed all the way back up that chain. And it's done really via a number of sort of operational practices. So there's a lot of deadline padding that gets put onto the investor that cuts down their time to vote, to pass the vote, usually through a proxy provider, through a custodian, a local agent, onto maybe an issuer agent before it gets there. So what all those operational people do in the chain really is they hold the voting up, because they don't have to recreate that operational work over and over and over, and they wait until the very end to pass it down the chain, at which point, the issuer then receives all the voting at the very end. With Proxymity, we create a unique pathway between the issuer and the investor. We collect the positions from the custodians to create a unique pathway of ownership that allows us to know who owns what shares. So when the issuer announces their meeting, it can be instantly delivered to the investor, and when the investor votes back, it can be instantly delivered electronically directly to the issuer. So that delay and waiting to the very end or padded deadlines goes away, and there's a direct instant connection and communication of votes to the issuer.
Excellent. Thank you. That's really, really useful. Jonathan, you were just going to add something?
Yeah, I think there's 2 points I would just add to that just to give context. The first one is why are things like that? And the second one is does everybody realise it's like that? The first one is the reason that the investor communications is difficult like that is just a consequence of the way shares are held, right? And look, that exists for a very good reason, to keep costs down. But that introduces this concept where we've got layers and layers of intermediaries effectively handling the same information. We're all doing the same thing to get it out to the person that really cares about it, and that's the shareholder of the company. To redesign the process, to make proxy voting seamless and then make holding and settling shares very, very complicated would be a little bit like the tail wagging the dog. Yeah. So, look, the reason the process is like that is, for a very good reason in terms of, look, it's cost effective to hold shares through intermediaries, not direct in every single market, connecting with the securities depository, or in some cases connecting with a local agent bank. So the reason for those intermediaries is very, very important, but it doesn't lend itself well to a seamless communication process because of the length of intermediaries involved. And if you multiply that sometimes in a cross-border scenario between a company and their real shareholder, it could be 6 or 7 intermediaries that have to handle the same information and pass it back and forth. And I think important for context, the first part of the journey in Proxymity was, look, we found a problem, we didn't quite know the solution. And what we said to ourselves is, have we got this right? Okay, let's go and speak to people and understand, is this right? We went and spoke to some of the largest issuers around, particularly in the UK. We spoke to their investor relations team, some company secretaries. We also spoke to the institutional shareholders and a lot of intermediaries in between and got their experience. And I think one of the most consistent themes was people at either end of the chain don't quite get the complexity in the middle. And I would always say, well, why should you? It should be easy. It's the industry, if you like, the way shares are held that's made your experience complicated. And a lot of them have put on top of that, band-aids or plasters to kind of shield them from the true complexity. And whether that's, agent services or their own spreadsheets or whatever, but the process has become complicated, and that leads to some quite strange end user behavior, which, we think in, particularly in the 21st century, can all be solved by, particularly by modern technology, and that's kind of what led us here on the journey.
Absolutely. So moving as we are now towards, we won't say the Brexit word, but we are looking at with that integration into Europe. We've got SRDII coming down the track. Talk to me or explain to our listeners what Proxymity does in terms of compliance here around SRDII.
Yeah, so when we originally started evolving the idea around Proxymity, SRDII was something being discussed within the EU, but there wasn't at that stage in time any, the directive wasn't finalised, there was no implementing regulation. So it's really something that's happened as we've been on the journey. So, we felt, proxy voting, appointment of proxies, whatever you want to call it, was something that we wanted to fix anyway. SRDII kind of brings to the forefront, lots of people looking to solve the problem. And really at the core of SRDII, I would say, are enhanced requirements for intermediaries when they handle proxy voting information and new requirements for issuers when they communicate that information, and as well as adjacent frameworks that are trying to be harmonised about shareholder disclosure and identity. So this is, if you like, something that's going to force a lot of change, going to force people to do things differently or do things they haven't done before. And Proxymity is ideally, we would say ideally suited to solve many of those problems. Everybody could run away and build their own solution to meet the needs of the requirements. But hang on a minute, we have a platform that we think is 80% of the way there, and we still have a year to run before these requirements come into force.
Yeah, and you mentioned there transparency, and that's at the forefront of a lot of issuers' minds, whether it's the enhanced transparency that they'll be able to obtain via SRDII. And one of the burning issues for registrars and issuer agents generally and issuers is the vote confirmations that SRDII requires. Assuming Proxymity provides solutions for that, can you just talk us through about how that works or what it actually delivers?
The vote confirmation?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so today, obviously, one of the main challenges is with that sort of process as it is today. When a vote gets submitted by an investor, that's often the last they hear of it. If they're putting it in via a provider at the end of the chain, it's flowing through the custodians, through a registrar registration to the issuer. They don't know then what happens at the meeting. Was their vote counted at the meeting? SRDII does seek to address this by mandating issuers to either proactively or upon request provide a vote confirmation. This is something we're doing already today in the UK market in Proxymity. So today, when we've submitted voting to the issuer agent, and it's then been represented at the meeting, we take a feed post the meeting of all the votes that were counted in an electronic file that then allows us to play back to the investor that their vote was actually counted at the meeting. And via the platform, they can see that. So it gives them a layer of transparency and comfort that their vote was represented, whereas in the old days, if you like, or prior to that, they wouldn't really know. So really, Proxymity is well poised for SRDII to support that new requirement that will be mandated on issuers.
Excellent. I mean, generally speaking, then information flow is king here. So it's not just about providing that data through the chain at the front end of meeting announcement. There's the voting or the proxy appointments process, and of course the vote confirmation at the end. So for issuers, I guess this is a good tick for good corporate governance because it's reaching a much wider audience. But what does Proxymity do in terms of its reach? So at the moment, Proxymity is a Citibank product. How are you going to engage with other custodians or other market players in order to expand your presence?
Yeah, so that's a really good point for us to touch on. The origin of Proxymity is from within Citibank, right? We were initially sponsored through Citibank's D10X program, which is an internal incubation funnel, if you like, trying to take brand new ideas from employees and evolve them either into standalone business lines or standalone product lines. I think we firmly believe for a long time, and so is the organisation, thankfully, that to maximise the value of Proxymity to both sets of end users, right? And remember, it's their problems we're trying to solve, the problems of the companies and the problems of their shareholders. To maximise the value and the benefit to them, Proxymity needs to connect with other custodian banks rather than Citi. Now, of course, Citi is a very large global custodian bank, the largest direct custody clearing network out there, but that is not only part of the picture for an issuer. The shares in issue of any one issuer are locked up in the accounts of multiple custodians. Yeah. And if you flip it on its head and look at the shareholders, institutional shareholders, very few have concentrated their entire custody provision through a single provider for obvious reasons, right? You would spread it with multiple providers purely from a risk point of view rather than concentrating it through one provider. Yeah. I'm not saying anything controversial there. So that kind of informed our strategy of how do we open Proxymity up to the marketplace as much as possible, and that's firmly part of our vision as Proxymity as a platform that anybody can connect with. The more people we connect with, the greater visibility and transparency we give to issuers and companies about their shareholder base, and the more problems we solve for an increasing number of institutional investors. And if you think about the average behaviour of an intermediary, they're all doing the same thing. They're all either handling this information or employing somebody to handle it for them in a very operationally burdensome manual way, which doesn't meet the needs of the directive, the implementing regulation, and a lot of the time doesn't make sense from a business point of view. Yeah. So we think we're appealing really to both sets of end users. That's whose problems we're trying to solve, as well as solve a problem that the intermediaries have by default, just by I'm the custody provider, I hold the share, so I have to facilitate this process.
Yeah, and this isn't a UK only problem either.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are obviously many wonderful flavours out there of how shares get voted in various markets.
One way to put it.
Yeah, weird and wonderful practices out there. Whether it's physical attendance, whether it's powers of attorney, whether it's voting on paddleboard. I've even seen. It's remarkable, but in general, the basis of the problem is the same everywhere. We have been mindful and very thoughtful about the platform for the UK market. It shouldn't look and feel the same as the platform for Spain or Australia or wherever else we may intend to go to. So there is some kind of nuances we need to factor into the process because every country has their own local regs and rules and legislation. But that's just all part of the challenge and all part of the journey as we roll the platform out.
And what are what are the company's aspirations for the future in terms of global reach?
So look, the immediate focus I think is on the EU markets with the impending regulation. It's creating a lot of demand for services. It creates new requirements that the ecosystem is looking for solutions in. But clearly there's markets outside the EU that are very, very large numbers of listed issuers, large amounts of institutional investor ownership. So we can't go everywhere at once for obvious reasons, but we have a pretty solid plan about how to take on. And if you can get the platform out to 35-40 markets, you're roughly covering 85-90% of the volume anyway out there, and that's just part of the natural kind of evolution of the platform.
Fantastic. Going back to the transparency issue, and I think this is going to be an important point to understand for issuer companies. It's all very well and good them understanding or trying to understand that they're going to have greater transparency. But what does that mean for them? What will they actually get, or what will they be able to see in terms of the underlying holder, if at all?
Yeah, well, as John said, if you think of the structures that are there today, often the issuer at the most basic level are only really seeing at a bank nominee level or group level. They can't see who the individual voters are.
That's certainly an issue that Lindsey and I have all the time with clients. All they get to see is that registered holder. If you're lucky, you can see the one below, but and you need specialist agents to do that. So I'm sorry to butt in there, Andy, but carry on, please.
No, it's a big part of the problem that John was explaining. So with Proxymity, what we do is we provide a level of transparency and reporting that the individual voters, the institutions who are submitting the votes, that the vote gets made visible to issue at that level. So when an institution agrees to participate in Proxymity when they're voting, an issuer can now see, as the vote is submitted, who has submitted it, which greatly assists them with engagement and being able to connect with the voting community, and that's all available via the platform. So that's a key part, really, if you think of the issuer benefit of Proxymity. That's the transparency we bring them.
Wonderful.
Thanks, guys. Just actually, if we could return perhaps to SRDII and just think, is there anything that we haven't touched on yet? And I'm thinking about disclosure implications. I wonder if you could maybe talk to us a little bit, explain what are the implications of disclosure under the regulations and also how Proxymity can help in that space.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we touched on the transparency piece already there previously, but under the new regulation, there's already mechanisms for disclosures to be requested in a number of the EU markets, but the SRDII regulation really sort of tightens that up and provides set templates, time frames in which intermediaries must respond to issuers or issuer agents when they request a disclosure. And they can request it as often as they want as well. So this means there's going to be added pressure on intermediaries to be able to respond electronically, timely, to disclosure requests, and issuers will now have a lot more at their disposal, really. But for an issuer also, they've got to have the right means to request it in the right format. So also for them, there's a challenge here. How do I want it? I want to ask for it. How do I do that? And what solutions are there?
Yeah, and I think shareholder disclosure it's been out there in several of the markets under different frameworks. I think what SRD2 does is aim to achieve a degree of harmonisation across the EU markets around shareholder disclosure. So in some markets it'll be a new concept. In other markets it will be a slight change of the rules.
This is supplemental to 793 in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. It's a concept that kind of many of us are kind of used to. I remember one of my previous jobs in Citibank was getting these Section 793 requests and then responding back. And so the rules will change. What the shareholder can, what the issuer can find out will slightly change, but how they must do it crucially changes. And again, like with a lot of regulation, the devil is in the detail, right? There is in the implemented regulation, in the annex, there is a set format and template that you must send to the intermediary to get them to release the information. If you don't comply, they're not then under duress to give up the information, and you have to, an issuer has to remember the intermediary there's nothing in it for them. Shareholder disclosure, they're disclosing their underlying clients, something that is a cost to them. So if you give them any reason to doubt your authenticity to receive that information, then they simply won't send it back. And then there is also a template that the intermediary must comply with to send the information back. Now, if as a company you can't reconcile and read those responses, you're going to be buried in paperwork. So, SRD2 implemented regulation is definitely about the how. It's how are these things now going to be done in a lot of countries. So Section 793 is the process we used to here in the UK, but that now the rules kind of change about how that's done. And there's other areas of SRD2. Corporate actions is also mentioned, right? Which is a whole other area. Now, kind of, I don't know whether depends what side of the fence you sit on, but the implemented regulation doesn't go into the same level of detail as to prescribe, formats for the announcement of each individual event and responses back. But you could definitely envisage a scenario where that's something that does come around again, right? For an extension of that. So. There's a lot to think about in SRD2, and the implementing date for these requirements is September next year.
2020,
there's an awful lot of considerations to think about. There's the concept of authenticating where the request came from. You have to remember, if you want to work out who your shareholders are, you're going to have to ask custodian banks to tell you who their clients are. Right, that's the name of the game in layman's terms. They're only going to release that information if they believe that the request has come from the person who's authorised to see it, which is the issuer or their appointed third party.
Yeah.
So we now need a mechanism for the intermediaries to authenticate the third party is the proper and correct third party to act on behalf of the issuer. So once you kind of get under the bonnet of SRDII, there's a lot of things to think about. There's a lot of moving parts that are different for each individual actor. I think where we're trying to come at from Proxymity is, look, that's our problem. Most listed companies out there are not connected on the SWIFT network. So if that's how they're going to communicate the shareholder disclosure request, let's try and give them an easy way to send the requests into the intermediaries. Let's give the intermediaries an easy way to respond back and forward on the request. Let's try to facilitate this information exchange, which now must take place. And that's really how we're thinking about designing the platform. Is the complexity is ours, and the simple solution really is to be given to the end user of the platform.
Thanks very much, guys. It's really interesting actually hearing all about the developments that have been happening at Proxymity, and you're obviously really ahead of the game in terms of what you're looking at developing next. Just in terms of that, it would be great to hear a little bit about the parties you're working with on your journey, actually, the institutions and companies that you're assisting and actually liaising with in order to come up with your next phase.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of it comes from the very kind of early work we did around validating the users and their behaviour and what service providers they're using today, who's helping them, manage their responsibilities right now. So on the investor side, when we're looking at where are your average institutional investors consuming meeting information and voting back today, but by far and away that a lot of them are using the services of proxy vote advisors, right? And the biggest one out there is ISS, and I think most issues will be aware of them and the role they play. I think it might surprise people the percentage of votes that, if you like, start their life on the ISS platform. Yeah. And if you profile your average institutional investor, they may be offering a number of different funds, each which have hundreds of separate positions in companies. Yeah. And then if you think about the average company general meeting, that might have here in the UK 20 agenda items, or less in some markets. There's some significant multipliers there. So if your average institutional investor, they might be having to make 8,000, 10,000 decisions, all often compressed into a 3-month cycle. So clearly that behaviour alone, before you kind of examine what they may want to do from a policy point of view, but purely from a functional point of view, it's an awful lot of decisions to make, and they're looking for solutions to help automate some of that. And really that's one of the, I don't want to speak on their behalf, one of the selling points of a proxy vote advisor, right? You can define a voting policy, we can furnish that with research, and we can, recommend how you might want to discharge your voting obligation in accordance with your policy. Of course, investor always retains the right to override that decision, but really profiling that behaviour led us to, okay, how do we work with these proxy vote advisors rather than work against them? What we've set out in the core vision of Proxymity is can we solve the communication problem, right? And clearly then working with them became something that we're very interested in, and we've recently launched a high frequency connection with them earlier this year. What that effectively means is our platform's completely interoperable with theirs. So, an investor can benefit from many of the things that Proxymity gives them, procuring the information from source. That comes incredibly quickly, giving them the maximum amount of decision time, which of course is beneficial to them to make the most informed decision possible, and giving them, as Andy mentioned earlier, the all-important kind of post-meeting vote confirmation, that finality of the process. And they can get all those benefits with no change in the process. Mm-hmm. So it's another kind of growth driver that we think is going to help, increase the visibility issuers will get on the platform, because we are working with some of the main agents, proxy vote advisory agents out there in the market. And I think on the flip side, certainly our work with Link is similar, but on the other angle, that we have a problem that we think we can bring to many issuers and solves a clear problem they have. But we're also aware that issuers procure a whole other range of services from their agents, and they continue to want to have that kind of single relationship, if you like, rather than have multiple individual relationships for tiny little different components. Proxy voting management AGM is kind of one component of that whole stack. And I think with the reach of somebody like Link, there's clearly a benefit to everybody there. We've got a platform that solves a problem. Link have got incredibly important place in many major markets, and access to some of the issuers that I think collectively together we can help.
Do well.
Great. So just to wrap up, I think we'd love to know, having heard so many developments, so many current issues that you're clearly addressing at Proxymity, which is fantastic. So if we can just put one burning issue to you, which is what, in the light of everything you're working on, what is the issue that's really keeping you awake at night?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that we talked about the importance of SRDII. I think that's a backbone of a lot of what we're working on and we're focused on between now and next September, because it's so important to so many of the people that we're working with. I think one of the challenges with SRDII is it does put out there a clear framework for a legislation guideline around what each market should adopt. But we've seen some delay in the markets coming out with their final implementing regulations. We're seeing some variation between how the markets are interpreting it. So although it does seem like a great uniform idea, maybe not surprisingly, there's different interpretations of that filtering through. And I think also there's certain people who September next year feels like a long time away.
Yeah.
And some people aren't maybe moving as quickly as they can on this or as quickly as we would like, in terms of confirming with the markets how things will work. So I think for some markets are going to be more complex than others. So for us, it's making sure we're ready for all of them, which we will be, in terms of having a complete solution that meets maybe some of the variations we're going to see.
Yeah, and I think, Andy, correct from the deadline for markets having drafted this and implemented it was already gone. Was it July this year?
June or July.
So I think we're just about into double figures of markets that have got something and got it done there. There's another, similar 9 or 10 markets with it in draft status. I think that's something because there are obviously certain elements that are in the implementing regulation, so there's very little, movement in terms of how that will be provisioned. But then there are other areas of the directive which can then be, there's a degree of interpretation at the member state level that then makes a more complicated ecosystem for everybody to navigate in, as well as some markets deciding to, gold plate their legislation with additional requirements, right? So I think that the recent one that springs to mind is Spain, where they're introducing this concept of potentially double voting rights for shares that have been held for a defined period, which is a concept that's been in Italy and France already with limited kind of success, I would say, and certainly a headache for people to kind of track that inventory. When do you accrue the double voting right? When do you lose it? It's more complexity, not less. And having that still up in the air with less than 12 months to go is not great position to be in for the industry, right? Yeah. And we're part of the industry, so I'm sure many other people are going to be saying the same thing about look, that's not an ideal place to be in. We'll have to see how it pans out, but we just have to be ready. You only do the best. It's kind of to a degree outside of our control, and hopefully, having done quite a bit of the work already, we do have the ability to make some last minute changes if needed.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think we're all poised to see what you're going to do next.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Check out the podcast description for more information on this episode's guests and presenters. And if you want to get in touch with any of us, we'd love to hear from you.